Hi, to be explained later here with another movie review. I'm thinking about doing these a little bit more often, and as I looked over the new rules that YouTube has set up for when you can monetize videos, I should be in the clear to put some backgrounds video up because my channel doesn't have 10,000 views. Hopefully that changes, but hey, at least I get to do this for now. And the movie I would like to talk about today is War of the Planet of the Apes. Now, again, I'm a little bit late to the boat on this one, but I did, however, write down my thoughts on the movie for when I did see it. So hopefully this video will be a little bit more streamlined than the last one. Fair warning, I personally don't care about spoilers, so I may just casually drop some information. So without further ado, let's get started. Now, the first thing I would like to point out about War for the Planet of the Apes is that if you're going in expecting another action-packed adventure like you did with Dawn of the Planet of the Apes and Rise of the Planet of the Apes, that is because of the way this film is marketed, and I feel that is the biggest downfall of this movie, which is the way that it was marketed. Rather, it was more slower, intimate character story, which I personally loved, and I thought was great for the movie, especially given how this movie is a send-off to Caesar, which is very important. This film was a lot more intimate than Dawn of the Planet of the Apes. Take, for example, and what I mean by that is that this one, you're focusing on like one character at a time. It's not like in Dawn of the Planet of the Apes where it's all like, let's see what's going on in the ape village, let's see what's going on with the humans, let's see what's going on with Koba, or they had three different things that the audience was focusing on. This one's a little bit more straightforward. You only focus on Caesar's journey. Part of this, I feel, has to do with the fact that the overall film feels like a Shakespearean play or a Greek tragedy, with Caesar taking our role of the tragic hero. Now, for those of you that are unfamiliar with Greek tragedies and tragic heroes, the best modern example I can think of would be Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing. But if you're looking for a classic Greek tragedy for all of those English buffs out there, Shakespeare's King Lear would probably be a better example, where the tragic hero's downfall is ultimately due to his own actions that go and bite him in the ass by the end of the first act and going into the second act, and then in the third act is the tragic hero's redemption. And this is almost the kind of arc that we get with Caesar. In the beginning of the movie, with his family, then when his family is killed, he goes out looking for revenge on Colonel Exposition. We'll get to that in a minute. But he goes on a revenge scheme, and as a result, he leaves his tribe of apes to go out on their own to find this new home that his son discovered. When they go their separate ways, Caesar goes off to find the colonel, and then eventually, when he finds out where the colonel is staying, which is at this fort that's up north, he finds that his tribe was captured by the colonel and his army, in part because he wasn't there to protect them, which is ultimately what I feel was the reason for it. And as a result, because he was off doing his own thing and because he stopped to help one of his tribe members, he gets captured, and now he's almost becomes this Christ figure who's pretty much crucified in front of his whole tribe, and he starts to suffer for the fact at first a lot of the apes don't trust him anymore because they left him in their time of need, and he regains that trust in the apes and he redeems himself in the end, and it's through his redemption that he ultimately meets his end. And that's the most I'll say on that. So in that type of sense, this movie really did feel like a Shakespeare drama or a Greek tragedy of sorts. Of course, if we're looking for like 100% Greek tragedy, it's missing the narrator, the chorus, all the bells and whistles. But I think it did great with what it had. There also felt like that there were a lot of biblical references in the movie, but the thing that I loved about this is that it was subtle enough you understood what it felt like, but it also didn't feel like it was hitting you over the head, and it also could have been open for different interpretations. Take, for example, if we're going in terms of the classic Planet of the Apes, I would describe this film as almost a mixture of Conquest of the Planet of the Apes and Battle for the Planet of the Apes, because in Conquest of the Planet of the Apes, you get the ape enslavement part, which is sort of what is touched upon in this movie, that the reason the colonel captures Caesar's apes is to make them work as slaves for him, building this wall to keep out these people that disagree with the colonel. Part of that is very reminiscent of the Holocaust, more so in the sense that the place that they're held is very similar to a concentration camp. And it was also very reminiscent of the slaves that were used in Egypt to build the pyramids. And with Caesar standing up for his apes, and he's like, he will endure this suffering until his people get food and water, so that way they can go back to work. He's ultimately fighting for the apes' lives in protest. This is like Caesar's save the cat moment, which he has several save the cat moments, but this is like the save the cat moment in the eyes of the apes, because this is part of his redemption. As far as using the apes to build a wall, you can interpret that as you want. I personally do feel it's supposed to be reminiscent of the slaves building the pyramids, or it could be reminiscent of current events. Who knows? I'm not the director. I'm not the writer. Now, in film technique standpoints, this film had excellent mise-en-scene. Take, for example, there's this great moment in the Colonel's office, or war room, where he sleeps and stays, and before Caesar says a line of dialogue about this, they sort of hint at the idea that the Colonel is in conflict with people other than the apes, because you see this map drawn out where you see his side and an opposing side that's making its way up to his fort. So before Caesar even mentions the line, and he actually says this, the soldiers coming to the north aren't coming to join you, it is implied that the Colonel is fighting a larger war than what we see. And another example earlier in the film was when they're dumping ape bodies back at Caesar's village. There's no line of dialogue, no sign language, nothing that tells the audience that they're dumping bodies in the river. It's all through the visuals that you see this happen, or you get this implication of it, because you never actually see them put the apes in the bag, tie it up, and then dump it in the river. No, you see these ape-sized body bags floating in the river, and then you see a pile of dead ape bodies. And that's all you need to know what's going on. And even at the very beginning of the film, with the first time that we see a gorilla that's working with the army, you see the word donkey sprayed on him, and just that enough can already depict to you this like difference in like class or status with it. The gorilla is being used as a slave. It's being used as a donkey. It's used to carry their stuff around. It's not seen as an equal. It's not seen as a soldier. It's seen as a tool, or a damn dirty ape. Of course, special effects are top notch. It's mind-boggling how real it is. Like, they do these extreme close-ups on the gorillas. They do it at least 3 times, because rules of 3. And I honestly cannot tell you whether or not that was a CG animated gorilla eyes, or if that was like an actual live gorilla. It's that good. It's freaky. The only things that really bugged me about the movie are pretty minor. Like I said earlier, this movie does an excellent job of showing, not telling, and then we get to Woody Harrelson's Colonel, and this is why I call him Colonel Exposition. We already see earlier in the film, we get clear depictions of this new strain of the disease that's been wiping out humanity, how people can't talk properly, how now the Colonel's been killing some of his own men if they're infected or they show signs of this disease, or he just leaves them out to die. And we already get like implications about some soldiers, they leave to take care of stuff, or there's people that don't necessarily agree with the Colonel that are working against him, or that are off on their own. And Woody Harrelson's Colonel Exposition, he basically confirms everything that we already almost figured out, or we were given the opportunity to figure out on our own, and then some. He flat out tells us why he's killing off people, why he abandons them. He actually leaves a whole line of dialogue which completely explains Nova at the beginning, towards the end of the first act. And I'll get to how I know that's towards the end of the first act, by saying how some people left to take care of the young and wounded, or they have kids of their own that they ran off with. Like, people actually ran away. Nova was one of the people that a soldier ran away and separated himself from the group to take care of. Or at least that's what I feel was implied through the dialogue. And so even then, that part was kind of clever. I don't know why I'm complaining about it now that I think about it. But there were some parts that I felt like you didn't need to say. And here's the thing, like, a lot of his exposition felt triggered from the line that Caesar said, that I mentioned earlier, that the soldiers coming to the north aren't joining you, are they? And then that's when the Colonel goes into his whole monologue about the history as to how the army split. I feel like for as much of a monologue as Woody Harrelson was given, and he's a great, terrific actor, and I'm not saying that give him less lines, I'm saying that use his acting ability, because it would have said even more and let the audience feel hooked and engaged with the story if he had either like a smaller piece of dialogue in response to that, rather than going into the whole history of his army and how it fell down, but like a smaller piece of dialogue or a facial expression or even silence would have spoken volumes more so, I feel, than his monologue. That's just me, but again, no movie is perfect, and to be honest, that's a pretty minor thing when, as I mentioned earlier, this movie does an excellent job of show, not tell. So, and I'll give it to them. A lot of the stuff that Woody Harrelson mentioned is stuff that you couldn't necessarily show, or even then, his line of dialogue about that kind of explains what's going on with Nova. That's probably one of the most essential things that he said during that monologue. Before I go into the other thing that bugged me, here's another thing that I love that I completely forgot to mention. I even made a note of it that said, remember to mention this, but Koba does appear in the movie. A lot of people would say that his role is very minor. I personally think they used him in such a genius way. Remember earlier when I was mentioning the elements of a Greek tragedy and how it's missing a narrator? It almost kind of has a narrator with Koba in a very weird way, because Koba, he only shows up twice in the movie, and it's very effective. This is part of how I could easily identify that, hey, we ran into Nova right before Act 1 ended, because Koba almost acts as a way for us to transition from Act 1 to 2, and from Act 2 to 3, because when he does appear, he's like this mental formation from Caesar, and he gives a line of dialogue that can put both a current or a previous scene into context. Take, for example, there was this white ape, Winter, which also, another thing that I love, like from the very beginning, when we first see Winter and we see Luca, which is another gorilla. You almost get this like weird conscious thing, because it's this shot with Caesar in the middle. In the foreground, you have the soldiers that were captured by the apes, and then next to Caesar on one side, you have Winter, who looks very conflicted, very nervous. Like, for a gorilla, Winter is a gorilla oxymoron. You have this big, hulking body, but you look very meek and weak and soft and sensitive, and Luca was just like the masculine, typical gorilla. It was almost like, when you think of your conscience, you have the angel on one side and the devil on the other. Well, in this case, the angel, Winter, who is very soft and weak, eventually betrays Caesar. And there was a scene where they go and confront Winter at one of the army's camps. And then after that scene, it wasn't made entirely clear what they did to Winter. And then after that scene, you have this Koba delusion, and all that he says is this one line of dialogue. Ape, not kill ape. And then he kind of laughs. And then we go into the second act. And that implies like a lot, just that one line of dialogue. The fact that Caesar saw him, the fact that this thing happened with Winter. And earlier, how we know Caesar always says, ape does not kill ape. And we get this sense that Caesar is changing. This is part of his descent. He feels like he's becoming more and more like Koba. And we get that very early on. And Maurice kind of has a single line, and even then, Maurice doesn't really talk except for later in the movie, like way late in the movie. He like signs to Caesar like, you're starting to be more like Koba. Koba's presence is felt very much throughout the movie up until his appearance that transitions us from Act 2 to Act 3, when Caesar is pretty much almost dead or dying, and Koba almost comes in like this like death to sort of like stroke Caesar's face and telling him that he can die. Again, Koba is there to put into context like what is going on with Caesar, like what's going on in his head. And he's used sparingly enough, and considering where he's used in the movie, I really do feel like that is intended to transition us from Act 1 to 2 and from 2 to 3. Because from the beginning of Act 2 to the end of Act 2, it starts to fall. Then by the time that we go into Act 3, that's when his redemption starts to pay off, and that's when things start to work out for him. Now, back to another minor thing that bugged me. And again, the things that bugged me are very minor, and I wouldn't be so critical about a movie if I didn't enjoy it. So another minor thing that bugged me about the film was that it did feel like this one, since it's the last prequel we're probably going to get for a while, was trying way too hard to set up the original Planet of the Apes. And we all know at this point that the girl's name is Nova. We learned that from a trailer. But then you have Caesar's newborn son in the movie, and yes, he has a new son. And guess what that son's name is? I'll give you one hint. It's a character from the original Planet of the Apes. I'll give you a couple seconds. Cornelius. His son's name is Cornelius, like the ape scientist from the original Planet of the Apes. And then there's the fact that they had to cross a desert to get to their new home. And as many of you remember from the original Planet of the Apes, if you guys still remember this, is that in order to get from the ape village in the original Planet of the Apes to the cave that held all the secrets of the Planet of the Apes, they had to cross this huge wasteland of a desert. And Dr. Zaius makes a whole point about it that no ape has gone that far in generations. So the fact that they mentioned that they had to cross a desert, and then again, Colonel Exposition, he has a whole line in his monologue that's dedicated to saying this one thing. That with this newest strain of disease is that it's making mankind more quote-unquote ape-like. They lose their ability to speech, and he says that we'll eventually become your cattle, which is exactly what happens to humanity in the original Planet of the Apes. The recent prequels for Planet of the Apes, they've been riddled with hints and little callbacks to the original Planet of the Apes, but those were very subtle. This felt like it was hitting us over the head with it, and I personally loved it that in the past two films, all these references were subtle. You had to go out and look for them. But in this one, you didn't. They just gave it to you. Overall, I love the movie. Biggest downfall to me, I feel, is the marketing. But don't let that stop you from watching this movie. If you loved movies like Logan, if you're looking for another character-driven story, this is the movie for you. If you're looking for a movie that you can figure things out before it tells you what's happening, this is your movie. If you're looking for a more focused, intimate story, this is your movie. Because this is probably the most film-like Hollywood has gotten in a very long time. Or at least with franchises. And it's the perfect send-off to a character that we've all come to know and love. Ape together strong.